Building on Tuesday starter code by the end of this week, so we got one more lecture tomorrow. You will have your base starter code for your DICE assignment. This is due next Friday, but if everyone needs a bit more time, I'm flexible with that deadline because this is your first large assignment where you have a lot of freedom on what to make. So yeah, just keep me updated, keep filling out your reflections, keep me posted on what you want to see. From the slides on Google Classroom, although they're from last year, the slides on numbered 33 through 37 are what I'm going to follow today. And I hope it still works. So to make use of this library, know that like p5.js has its own thing. Now we're going to borrow some code from another library. So this is called p5.dom. DOM stands for Document Object Model. It does things for you, like buttons, so you don't have to make them by yourself. So p5.dom. Oh, right. Okay, let's try this out. Let's hope it still works. This was kind of a hack, because like CodePen that we use right now, um, it charges money to let you do more things. But one of my students last semester figured out a workaround, and let's hope it still works. So in slide 35, this is the library. Notice it's a URL, and the important part here is p5.dom.min.js. Okay, it might be out of date. Let's see if it still works. But this thing is what lets you borrow like pre-made buttons, and it borrows it from HTML. So when you copy this link, just like when you start a new pen, you go to JavaScript, and then you'll add this. How do I do that? I put it here? Yeah, down there. So you don't search it up, because if we look up p5.dom, that's not originally there. So instead, we give it a URL that tells it p5.dom, this is the part you pay attention to. And once you have that, you save and close. Looks like it worked. Let's find out. And then copy and paste this line below. So my slide, it highlights that it's down here. Save and close. And now let's see if our button code actually works. So on the reference, it has code and samples for you to check out over here. Where is it? No button. 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 There is no button. Okay, well, let's see what happens. So from the reference, notice these are the new lines that you have. The button is a variable, and then this is the stuff that makes it. So we're just going to copy and paste that. Let's do something similar. Var button. You declare it up here. In setup, we follow their example. There should be a click me button at position 1919. That's going to change my background color. And then we borrow this line of code. Let's place that after draw. And then we save and run, and let's see. Click me? Okay, there it is. Click me. So once you click this thing, it activates this function, which generates a random background of a shade of gray. At the moment, when we click this button, it doesn't work because our base code already drew a background way up here. So it always makes it white. So I think if I comment that out, I save and run, yeah, now you have different shades of gray. So this code still works. And now you can tie with these button behaviors different functions. So at first it was just a bunch of copy and pasting. Let me go over line by line what's going on. So at the very beginning, just like you did for your counter for most of your games, right? We were displaying a value from your dice. This one is a variable that's going to hold that button like object, button data. This is what your button's being called. So in your setup, line 8 in my code, that was directly copy and pasted from the example, button equals create button, click me. Create button is the one that makes it exist. This text is determined what's going to be displayed on your button. So it's like, let's make it odd, right? So we save and run, and notice as I change this part of that line of code, you see the words here change. And notice it like grows depending on the size of your word. So there's a bunch of gibberish, and now the button's going to be super long, blah, 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 blah. It kind of adjusts for that. So that's kind of nice, because previously, like with text boxes, we had to define length and width. this thing's handy, it kind of does that for you. So there, this is going to be odd. And let's try to add that line of code. Like when I click this button, this specific button, notice it's not anywhere on the screen. We're adding more complex behavior. When I click this button, odd numbers will then like create a rectangle, maybe on the left-hand side. That's where we're going to go. Notice this line, it's a little different. Button.position 1919. These are XY coordinates, likely the upper left-hand corner. The pattern you notice is very similar to the rectangle function, and that defines where it is. So if I increase the x coordinate by 100, now it's 119, we expect it to go over like here somewhere. Save and run. Boop, boop, yep. Maybe I want to move it down a bit more, 200 pixels down. Remember, your y coordinate grows positively, so now it goes down over here, okay? That much works as is. Now what's weird so far is this dot thing. Okay, pay attention to that. Make sure that that is there. Later in my class, when we go over object-oriented programming, this dot will make a bit more sense. When you take AP Computer Science A, you're going to see this again towards the beginning. But at the moment, associate this stuff like your whole variable name. Your button, it has a name, it's called button, and now we're just changing its position. There are other like qualities of a button that you can change, but I'll just pause it there. Pay attention to this keyword, position. There are other ones, you can find out what those are. And the weird part is, it's like this position, I think, is a variable, but then mouse pressed is like a function that's tied to a button. And like, I don't want to overwhelm you with the amount of stuff, but notice now it's that same dot, and then you access what happens when the mouse is pressed. Notice this stuff, it gets even weirder. Once the mouse is pressed, notice it goes to change background. Okay, that was the second part that I copy and pasted. That's a function that you make. It's your own line of code or your own shortcut that tells it what to do. So here it changes the background. And what does it mean to change BG, change background? It's this code down here. So let's modify that. Okay, we're going to change the behavior that happens when you press this button. Instead of changing the background, I want to, what did I do last time? Oh, yeah, I checked if things were even. Now I'm going to do something if it's odd. So now maybe I'll change this function name to be check even. Okay, and notice if I change that word and I run my code, like now nothing happens. Because this stuff doesn't match. Change background. So here, we change the name, make sure it matches, or check even, my bad. Check even, no S. Yeah, check even. And now instead of drawing the background over again, I'm replacing this code. So here's a comment. This function checks to see if my Beanos dice value, counter value, is even. Question? Related to this?
Yes.
Okay, what's up?
Something's going on. Where did you put the button? Create button.
Create button, button.position, and button.mousepress goes into setup. Otherwise, because like from our quiz, right, the draw function repeats it again and again and again. You're going to have a bajillion buttons being created on top of one another. We don't want that. Now, the weird part about this is, since we're borrowing this code from like HTML, it's kind of separate from like your P5 stuff, like your canvas, so it persists. It stays on the screen. Notice when the background's being drawn over and over again, the button still lays on top of it. It's not covered up like things from before. It's a subtle behavior, but I'm glad you pointed it out. So that's why it's in setup. Create button, button.position, mouse.pressed, it goes in setup. Think about this as a more complicated initializing step for your fancy button variable. Good question. Okay, so as I scroll down, maybe I'll show you more of the code in case you're following along. We are making this check even function. So from before, we have our counter, or your valued, Beano dice value, my bad, dice value, that's what I called it. Beano's dice value. Okay. Now, since it's a variable we declared at the very top, this function can now check its value. So Beanos dice value, die value, thank you. Die value now we're kind of doing the opposite. Last time we learned about this percent sign, it's the remainder function. Now when we divide it by 2, shoot, it equals, yeah. So now if you have a remainder and you are, I want to do the opposite one. So my bad. Let's check this one's odd. Yes, check odd so things are consistent. Odd. So now if you divide by 2 and you have a remainder, that is a remainder of 1, we're going to do some special code. What are we going to do? We're going to draw a rectangle to the screen. Let's make it on the left-hand side, so you have a tiny x-coordinate, let's say 40. We're going to have it be down here. Let's have it at 300, and let's have you be 100 by 50 pixels, something like that. Okay. Notice check odd is a function I made. Depending on your rules, you may have different functions or different rules of your game tied to different buttons, different functions. Okay, now if I click save and run, did I break my code somehow? I kind of did. You remember this part from yesterday? Like the text is all on top of one another, my rectangle's always there. I need to add back my background that I temporarily commented out at the beginning of this video. Okay, so the first rule is like if I click the screen and the number is even, then I display a circle. But if I click on the specific button and I'm checking my dice value, it should be a rectangle. And at the moment, even though like right now, let's get an odd number, like 1. We expect to see a rectangle, but no rectangle is there. Something's happening. Previously we saw it, but now it's not here. And this is where it gets tricky. And I gotta think. So as we borrowed some code from another library, there are like 2 functions that are kind of like listening to a mouse being pressed. So like right now, when I click on this button, this odd button, it triggers this check odd function. Or maybe I just didn't type things in right. But like the order of this is tricky. Like your check odd function may be called after you draw your background. So notice like if I put this back in and then I run it and save, first roll, okay? So one of those 2 numbers was probably a 1 in here and that got triggered. However, like because your background isn't being drawn, you see more things than possible. That was a really bad explanation. So, like, if your button function runs before your background, it's being covered up by your background. That's why we didn't see a rectangle. We needed it to be check your value after the background's being drawn, and that's where it gets interesting. So let's do it like this. If it is odd, your background will be white over here. And let's see if we see something different. Shoot, did I break it? Did I spell something wrong? I should see a rectangle, but I'm not. This one. It is commented out. So let's try this one more time. So I press my number, it's 4, so the circle is being drawn. When I click my button, it should re-roll. Weird, okay? There it goes. Did you see that? So I'm clicking. 1, 6. However, the rectangle's still there. You may not want that. Okay, I click it again. 1. Notice this time my rectangle wasn't being drawn. Correct? And let's keep clicking. So 3, it's an odd number. So then I do see my rectangle. I press 6. The rectangle still remains because the draw function code from mousepress is being executed. I press 6 again. Background's being drawn regardless. My circle's being covered up. Good. Now here's the weird part. So it looks like 1's broken. 1 divided by 2, you should get a remainder of 1. And currently I don't see my rectangle. 2, something wacky happens. Why do I see my rectangle? Time after. Do you notice this subtle difference? Yes? Kinda? Okay. You see it, right? So, like, this is one of the biggest challenges with like getting your timing right, because a button's mouse pressed, right? Sometimes it's detected before the screen is being drawn, sometimes it's not. You get these other behaviors. If you notice the rectangle, it may be actually displayed 1 later. See that? 1 frame later. So when I click this, notice it's 1, right? So regardless of my output next time, I'm going to see a rectangle on the screen. It's even. I see my circle and I see my rectangle. I press 2. Rectangle disappears. Why? Because your old dice value was actually 2. 2 divided by 2, there is no remainder. Click it again. 5. When I click this again, regardless of my next output, I see my rectangle. Do you see that? Kinda? So I'm going to pause it there, because this is a good problem to have, but it's conceptually like really challenging to address. So my next lecture tomorrow, we're going to pick up right here. How do we fix this thing? And even detecting it, it was so subtle that because we're still learning, that as beginners, I don't think you may have picked up on like that difference. Okay? So if you are reviewing this, make sure you understand, why do I see this rectangle 1 frame later than when I expected it to see it. Okay, make sure that makes sense, and then going into tomorrow's lecture, you should have enough starter code for you to implement your respective dice game. Any final questions? This is heavier on lecture material. This one is being recorded. I hope the first lecture video, or the first starter code, that was enough to get you off the ground. We had worked on in previous assignments.